So Chapter 5, KSU 3, it's about why individual languages vary. So we're going to look at the main dialects in the United States. We're going to look at what a dialect is. We're going to understand the ways that the British and the U.S. English dialects vary. And we'll talk about why it's sometimes difficult to distinguish whether something is a language or a dialect. So a dialect is a regional variation of a language, and it's distinguished by its own distinctive vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. The boundaries of where regional words are used can be mapped, and a word usage boundary is known as an isogloss. So an isogloss map would look kind of like the isoline maps, where it showed you the change in land contour. An isogloss map would show you the different dialects. So that's pretty cool. A large number of speakers and widespread distribution in the United States has contributed to the existence of a large number of English dialects. So the more spread out or more diffused a language is, the more likely it is to have dialects because of, again, that distance decay, right? That distance decay leads to stimulus diffusion. Things start to change as the further they get away from their hearth or their origin. The first part of our dialects in the United States can be traced back to the 13 original colonies. And so if you're going to start with mapping dialects in the United States, you start with those 13 colonies. And so you have 3 dialect regions. One, New England, inhabited by settlers from England. Then you have the southeastern area. So half people in the southeastern area came from southeastern England, and the others represented a diversity of social class backgrounds. There were a lot of penal or prison colonies established in the southeastern United States by England. And so a lot of that diversity of social class backgrounds comes from the history of penal colonies. And so the language of the South in the United States has been different from the very beginning because southeastern England speaks different than the northern England. So we've always had a language difference there. And then 3 is the Midlands. It's the most diverse group. So you had Quakers fleeing England because of religious persecution. You had lots of Scots and Irish coming there. You had a lot of German people, Dutch and Swedish migrants, all in the middle part of those 13 colonies. And so those languages have always been a little bit different. And you can trace those patterns still today. And things like a large group of Amish are still in Pennsylvania, although they're moving because land's expensive, like we talked about back in Chapter 4. You can still see that German and Dutch tradition there. You can see some Scot-Irish tradition in some of the mountain areas there. So what are some current dialect differences in the East? English words would be specific to a dialect usually refer to rural life because they don't have as much contact with larger urban areas. Food, so you could recognize the dialect differences in the United States by talking about food. And objects from daily activities. Language differences tend to be greatest in rural areas because of limited interactions with people from other dialect regions. So we're talking again about that distance decay again. But mass media or time-space compression has reduced the number of regionally distinctive words. And even some of the examples that we talk about as dialects in English, you would be familiar with even if you didn't live in that region. So the term y'all is not strange to people now. You know, we've seen it enough on television that if you hear someone say y'all and you're not from the southern part of the United States, you know that means you all or everyone or guys, you know, like, hey guys, y'all. These aren't strange words. We talked about the soft drinks in the beginning of the year, but again, like this shows your patterns of regional dialects. And I've never said pop in my life, and I'm from that area here. I think my family maybe said soda. I don't know. But I've never referred to a soft drink as a pop. But so you can see sodas predominantly in this area here, southern Illinois, and the Southwest. Coke is how people usually just refer to soft drinks in the South. Pop up here in the North, and then some places we don't have much data on. And you can definitely be different, you know, like I've never said pop in my life. Here's some different speech areas. As you can see, here's our 3 main regional areas, the northeastern area, the Midlands, and the southeastern. And there were changes in our language patterns from the very beginning because of the relocation diffusion, because of the different migration patterns into the original colonies. And then you can kind of break these up into even smaller regional dialects. If you look at the United States as a whole, we've got some general dialects, right? The Midlands, the Northern, the South, and the Western. So these areas here have dialects coming from the original colonies. Southeastern, again, from the southeastern England colonies and the different penal colonies, and the northern from usually the more well-to-do English colonists. And then within, you can see in this isogloss map, you can see that you have different dialects appearing as well. So people from New York City might speak differently than people from, Maine. And I'm from here, and I speak differently than someone from New York. In the United Kingdom, there's dialects as well. So languages with multiple dialects may recognize one standard language that is widely recognized as the most acceptable for government, business, education, communication, etc. So in English, we in the United States, we call it Standard American English, SAE. So that is the pronunciation, the phrasing, the language patterns you hear by most news anchors, and not all, but many politicians. So the language patterns you hear people speaking with usually an authority in the United States would be Standard American English, and the English that you're taught in class is Standard American English. In England, or the UK, it's known as British Received Pronunciation, so BRP. So our Standard American English is not BRP, right? American English is essentially a dialect of UK English. The English language is most noticeably different from the United States to England in three ways. Vocabulary. In the United States, we had lots of new objects and experiences that weren't present in England, and the climate and geography differed between England and America, so that led to changing in our language patterns. Spelling. Noah Webster, the guy who wrote the Webster's Dictionary, wanted to make English used in America distinct from England to kind of break down our cultural dependency on the United Kingdom. So they changed spellings of his words. So some things like theater are spelled differently in the UK and in the United States. So in the United States, it's ER, and in the UK, it's RE. You might see like E's added to the end of words in British spelling and not in American spelling. And pronunciation. The chief cause of the change in pronunciation was, again, that distance decay, right? We had limited interactions between England, so the longer we were separate from them, the longer we were a colony, and then eventually our own kingdom, our language started to kind of change and blend. So while we still speak English and it's mutually intelligible, we have words that are very different. A lot of words that were invented after the colonies were established, you're going to find the greatest difference in. So things like an elevator. An elevator is called an elevator here. It's called a lift in England. The trunk of a car. The trunk of a car. Cars weren't around when, they didn't come around until the 1800s, way after we had already gotten our independence. So in England, they call the trunk of a car the boot. And in the United States, we call it the trunk. So two different words for something that didn't exist when the English colonists were still living in, Great Britain. Cigarettes, same thing. They have different words for cigarettes, umbrellas, apartments versus flats. So these are all things that were really like post-industrial revolution, so post the colonial period. And so you're going to have greater differences in those terms. So how do you tell if something's a different language or a different dialect? It's hard to determine whether languages are distinct or whether they're dialects of the same language. And so sometimes it's not as hard, right? So like the English spoken in the UK and the English spoken in America, mutually intelligible. There's some geographical differences in vocab, but overall, like you could understand someone speaking from England. So it's clear it's a dialect of the same language. The further you get away and the more widespread a language is sometimes, or the more isolated the language might have been, the harder it is to tell. So in Italy, many languages were classified as dialects of Italian, and now many of them are seen as distinct enough to give them consideration as their own language, like Sicilian or Lombard or Ligurini. So all these languages can be seen as distinct languages, and that makes sense because if you think back to what hopefully, or maybe you've learned about in history about England or about Italy, is Italy was divided into independent city-states. And so really prior to like the modern era, Italy was divided into little tiny independent city-states that didn't, unify. And so that the fact that their language dialects might be different enough to be classified as their own language makes sense because they were essentially independent. And so that history makes sense that they would have these differences in their language. Whereas the United States, our differences follow some other cultural differences as well, but we've always been seen as one nation. And so we wouldn't have had, and we didn't have the history. If we had hundreds of years of independent city-states, then being unified under one nation, we would have a harder time with those dialects might become more different. So if you see an area that has problems classifying its language as dialects or language, you probably can see some of its history as far as its cultural history or its political history. Another example is Mandarin. Well, Mandarin has tons of dialects, and dialects should be mutually intelligible. Dialects from two extreme areas in China, they may not be able to understand each other. So if you're speaking to someone who speaks a dialect of Mandarin and they're in a region that's close to you, you'll probably understand them. But if you take the two most extreme dialects of Mandarin and have them speak to each other, they may not be able to understand each other. So in general, dialects are mutually intelligible, but there is some debate and there is some variation in that as well.